think we might get started. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which we meet today, which is the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and to acknowledge their contributions past, present and into the future. Just before we kick off, a little bit of housekeeping. Please turn mobile phones off to silent. If we need to exit in case of an emergency, you need to come down to the front and go out through the doors on my left or right. We will be recording tonight's lecture and taking photographs throughout, so if you prefer not to have your photo taken, could you please let the photographer Lynn know ahead of time. If you need to go to the bathroom, you also come down to the front and go out the doors on my right, and it's a little walk around to the back of the building, but it's well signposted. After tonight's lecture, we will be serving drinks in the foyer, so I invite you to stay and please join us for a drink and some casual chat. Now, with us tonight are some special guests, and I'd just like to acknowledge those, especially Mrs. Jan Marjoribanks. The memorial lecture is in the memory of her late husband, Kevin Majoribanks, and I really want to acknowledge Jan for coming all the way from Sydney to attend tonight's lecture. So thank you very much, Jan. I'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Peter Routley, who is a strong supporter of the School of Education and the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Adelaide. So thank you for attending, Peter. And his friends Brian and Jude Ward, thank you for attending. From the University of Adelaide, I'd like to acknowledge in attendance Professor Phil Levy, the Pro Vice-Chancellor for Student Learning, Professor Jenny Shaw, the Executive Dean, the Faculty of Arts, Associate Professor Suzanne Lemire, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Professions, Professor Michael Liebelt, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Sciences, and James Litt, the Development Officer for the Faculty of Arts and Professions. From the School of Education's Advisory Board, I'd like to acknowledge Peter Lynn from the Teachers Registration Board, Peter Mader, who's the South Australian Secondary Principals Association President, and Robert Smedley, who's from Trinity College. I'd also like to acknowledge Jan Keegley, a previous head of school, and Margaret Seacombe, a very valued adjunct member of staff. I've received apologies from Professor Pascal Quester, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice-President Academic, Professor Alastair Blunt, the Executive Dean, the Faculty of Health Sciences, and Professor Christopher Finlay, who's the Executive Dean from the Faculty of Professions. Just a little bit of information about the Kevin Majoribanks lecture. The Kevin Majoribanks Memorial Lecture was established in 2007 in honour of late Emeritus Professor Kevin Majoribanks from the University of Adelaide, who was the Vice-Chancellor from 1988 to 1993 and the Dean of the School of Education until his retirement in 2005. Professor Majoribanks believed that education is a lifelong commitment which does not happen in a vacuum, but involves the careful consideration and orchestration and input from the family, the culture and society. His research led to greater understanding of the substantial impact of parents and other family members and that impact on children's educational opportunities. He was also passionate about teacher education and teachers' professional learning. Professor Majoribanks believed that good teaching is linked intimately to active research. In his work, he has not only touched many who studied under him, but also influenced scholars around the world. Professor Majoribanks has published over 8 books and 250 articles. His last significant book publication was called Family and Social Capital: Towards a Context Theory of Student School Outcomes. The Memorial Lectures, past and present, honours Professor Majoribanks' legacy and continues the fine tradition of discourse, dialogue and debates within our educational community. It is very fitting that this year's Memorial Lecture, Welfare to Wellbeing, is being delivered by Associate Professor Matthew White. Associate Professor Matthew White is an award-winning educator, researcher, speaker and author who specialises in positive education, and positive organisational scholarship. He is an alumni of the University of Adelaide, and his PhD was conferred at the University of Adelaide in 2004 under the supervision of the late Professor George Smolich AM and Dr. Margaret Seacombe. Currently, Matthew is the Director of Wellbeing and Positive Education at St Peter's College, where he has served on the school's senior leadership team since 2011. In addition to his employment at St Peter's College and as an academic, Matthew is Principal Fellow and Associate Professor in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne, an Adjunct Lecturer at the University of Adelaide, and an affiliate of the Wellbeing Institute at Cambridge University. Matthew has been a senior secondary school teacher of literature and French for over 20 years. He has 15 years boarding experience and more than a decade's executive leadership experience across education, public and social sectors serving at St Peter's College, the Social Enterprise Teach for Australia, and Geelong Grammar School. Matthew is the Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Applied Positive Psychology. He has published 3 books on wellbeing, authored 21 book chapters, and presented internationally on character education, leadership, governance, and wellbeing. Matthew is a highly regarded speaker, and he has received invitations to be keynote speakers at conferences around the world. Matthew was also awarded the Fellowship of the Australian College of Educators in 2016, and he was an Australian Council for Educational Leaders South Australian Leadership Medal in April this year, and the National Australian Council for Educational Leaders Leadership Award later this year. His most recent books are Future Directions in Wellbeing, Education, Organisations and Policy, published by Springer, and Theology and Positive Psychology, published by Whip and Stock. It is my great pleasure to now hand over to Associate Professor Matthew White to deliver tonight's lecture.
Thank you, Faye, very much for that very warm introduction. It's a great privilege to be here at the University of Adelaide, back at the University of Adelaide, to deliver this lecture in particular. And also thank you so much to all of you for braving the tram intervention on North Terrace and getting here tonight. That's a huge achievement. So in the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to outline how I'm going to tackle this year's Kevin Majoribanks lecture. Before I do that, I want to start with a few thank yous to people who are in the room in particular. I'd like to first of all thank Faye for the invitation on behalf of the School of Education to deliver this year's lecture. It was an incredible honour. My initial response when Faye asked me was no, and I listed about 25 other people who I thought would be appropriate, and then she convinced me otherwise as an alumni to deliver this lecture. I did know Kevin. He was literally overseeing the final stages of my submission of my PhD in 2004, and I'll touch down on that in a moment. And we shared a couple of things in common, which we were reminiscing about earlier. And also, thank you also to Mrs. Majoribanks as well, who had a lovely conversation with earlier, and we've shared some fantastic memories of the late Professor Majoribanks. And also his legacy, which continues today, which I will touch down upon during this lecture in particular. So, but also I just want to highlight, because otherwise you forget in the journey that happens in the next 50 minutes or so, a couple of people I'd like to mention in particular. So really actually I was thinking this has been a great opportunity for me personally to reflect on my professional practice and also my scholarly journey in the last decade or so in terms of academia, in terms of who have been the 3 big sort of people who I've really actually stood on their shoulders and actually enabled me to do some of the work which I've been doing in the last decade or so, and they are the late Kevin Majoribanks, so Dr. Margaret Seacombe, who's here in the front row, who huge influence on me, one of my co-supervisors in my PhD, and of course the late Professor George Smolich. In fact, I think I'm actually the last PhD student of Professor Smolich, just before he passed away. And so they really actually sort of set me on my pathway. Interestingly, my topic for my PhD actually I think does intersect quite strongly with the research work that I've been doing for the last 7 years, and also which will be the topic and the focus of this evening's presentation. But also I just want to acknowledge 4 of my current coachee mentors in particular who have had big influence on me. David Cooperrider, who I will mention, who is based at Case Western University in the USA. Also John Hattie, who huge influence and a good, great coach to me as well. Field Rickards, who's Dean Emeritus at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, who really is the person who got me into the MGSE in 2006 as a fellow, and then began a fantastic journey. And one of my co-authors, Lee Waters, who is currently the Chair of Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne and also the current President of the International Positive Psychology Association. And so I would really like to say that my being here today, and I've been reflecting on that, is really actually standing on the shoulders of many other people in that as well. I'll also mention as I'm going through, but it's great to put this up front, many of my co-authors who are behind me on work that I've published, which I will cite throughout the presentation this evening, but I wanted to put them up because sometimes in the cut and thrust of delivering a talk, you can sometimes overlook that. As mentioned as well, these are my disclosures in terms of my current roles and also pro bono work that Faye touched down on, just so that you know that when I go through there, that's sort of me in a nutshell behind there, which Faye introduced very nicely indeed. So now on to the substantive matter of this evening's Kevin Majoribanks Memorial Lecture. So in discussing a topic that would be suitable for tonight's lecture with Faye, back in April it was, I think, we talked about what sorts of big issues in terms of the current research which I've been looking at, and also in the last 7 years and publishing upon, but also currently what is topical at the moment within current education policy research and also issues within education more broadly. And so what I'm going to cover tonight is why primarily is Kevin Majoribanks' research legacy really actually still matters. There is a huge substantial contribution which he has made to scholarship in his substantial contribution to education, but why is some of the findings in particular that he found around the issues around family, inequality and accomplishment as relevant today in 2017 as they were when they were written about. And in many ways, many of his early works were true lightning rods to issues which are still contemporary today. Secondly, also then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that into context of what's actually going on in contemporary Australian educational landscape in 2017. I'm going to offer some reflections on the complex nature of teaching and pre-service teacher training and more broadly, and then also the opportunities within future directions. And so that's sort of the arc of the journey which I'd like to go on with you in the next 44 minutes or 45 minutes or so. And at the end we'll have time for questions. And then delving back, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, into Kevin Majoribanks' research legacy, the thing which struck me more than anything else was that Kevin really did grapple with big questions. They were very, very large questions in terms of his research, and they were also very significant in terms of research policy and also the nexus between the relationship between family, accomplishment and ethnic background. And in terms of the arc of his journey leading towards much of this scholarship, what I found in particular in revisiting some of this work, which I'll then actually dovetail into what's actually happening within the contemporary landscape in 2017, I'm always reminded, and it was a great learning for me from having reflected upon this, is that Kevin was really concerned about very, very large questions, but then also was able to dovetail that into the individual experience of families, the individual experience of teachers, and reflect on the individual experiences of children. And it's a great learning, I think, for researchers today, that the breadth of the big questions that he asked, he never lost sight of the fact that at its heart, education is really actually a human endeavour. It's about building the whole child, and it's about building the interior world of the child, which enables the agency for young people to move from one place to another place. And that, I think, comes from the depth of the big picture questions that he really was actually exploring. In order to do that, and I'm going to just point out Kevin and I actually had some very interesting coincidences in our personal lives, but also our careers. And it wasn't actually in the official biography that Faye outlined about Kevin's contribution, but Kevin actually was a teacher where I teach now at St Peter's College in the 60s. And like all good schools, they have a pretty good archives department. So when I found out I was doing this lecture, I said, let's go back to the 60s and see if I can find a photograph of a much younger looking Kevin Majoribanks, and I found one. So in 1963, Kevin Majoribanks was Lieutenant Majoribanks then, in one of the activities at St Peter's College. And you can see all these very polished looking young gentlemen there, and if you've got really good eyesight, you might be able to find Kevin Majoribanks somewhere in the midst of all of this. He's not, you look at the picture, he's probably young enough to actually look like a current year 12 in this photograph, and I just happened to have blown up the photograph. There he is there. And so I thought also, well, it's interesting because usually when a staff member serves at the school, they have a velete when they move on, because from St Peter's College, Kevin went on this incredible arc in terms of his educational experience. If you think of really actually from rural Grafton as a teacher, and then also doing distance ed through University of New England, and then ending up at St Peter's College teaching mathematics. He taught what's called the new mathematics. I'm not quite sure what the new mathematics is, whether it's still new or not. And then he also then moved from Saints to Harvard, then to Toronto, then on to Oxford, Stanford, and then back to Adelaide. So he sort of came full circle. But what's very interesting is that if you look at his velete when he leaves St Peter's College, there's a lovely description. I think this is why Kevin and I got along quite well, because the description in the velete in 1966 when Kevin moves on from St Peter's College is that he coached the third 11 cricket. Now, I can't claim to be a cricketer of any fame at all, but I do coach the Senior B tennis team, which I think is the equivalent, and I've got 20 years' experience. No one ever trains you for that. And we always used to have a laugh about those sorts of the education which is outside of the classroom, and how the education outside of the classroom can be just as important, just as invalid as the education that takes place within the classroom. But that was something which we shared in common as well. The other interesting coincidence both Kevin and I shared, which we used to joke about, was I had the opportunity to study at the Principal Centre at Harvard University in 2005, 2006. And Kevin also shared with me the many happy times that he had when he was studying at Harvard, which I was talking with Mrs. Majoribanks about this evening. So that early part of Kevin Majoribanks' career at St Peter's College is very interesting when you compare it with really actually what is the focus of his later research, which is around educational inequality primarily, and the differences that young people have because of the social situation that they find themselves in. But if we look at the whole discourse of his work, if you look at, as I said, focuses upon the big picture, over 200 articles, as Faye pointed out as well, primarily around inequalities within education and the outcomes that can happen for young people as a result of that. At the backbone of his research work, though, was this relentless focus upon having a hypothesis, really strong theoretical models, and then testing the validity of that hypothesis. And that really is actually something which is actually fundamental to his research. Also, which was relatively unique in the field of teacher education at that time, was increased use of data to inform professional practice, increased use of data to inform decision-making around policy, around evidence-based decision-making, which was so critical. And also, as I mentioned before, and this is something which I remember reading about back in 2003, was this view of the child's inner room, the child's ability to develop their own understanding about a potential future, which is so important. And I just wanted to start this lecture in particular by highlighting what I think are three really pivotal papers, which I'll then dovetail into the substantive matter of the presentation I have for you this evening around Kevin's work. And they really actually are around the impact that environments have upon the outcome that young people experience, where they are educated, how they are educated, and with whom they are educated. And then also, what I think is most important is the aspirations of young people and the impact of aspiration in being able to realise a future version for yourself, in that second paper in particular from 1989. And also, one which I found most interesting was looking at the relationship between siblings and how within families you can have one sibling do particularly well and one not so well. And so these three papers in particular, when reviewing Kevin's work, really actually piqued my interest in terms of this evening's presentation. And I'll come back to those later on. So these three big areas which actually Kevin's work really actually focused upon the role of inequality in education, the role of the family, and also one down the bottom represented by that photograph, which I haven't touched on, was ethnic background, as was described at the period. So those three factors really actually deeply informed his work, and also the work of his colleague, Professor George Smolich and Margaret Seacombe, in their life course of their contribution to education here in the School of Education at the University of Adelaide. But there was one quote when I was surveying all of these works in terms of Kevin's contribution which really stuck to me, where he argued as late as 2002 in terms of his work, that one of the most persistent challenges that was confronting societies was how to reduce the inequality in the educational and occupational attainment of students from different socio-economic, ethnic and race group backgrounds. Perhaps today in contemporary policy we would describe this as a wicked problem in terms of policy, that it is a problem that as we try to solve it, it actually is evolving and changing at the same time. So now, having just as a starting point, just done a quick review of Kevin's contribution to the discourse in these three big areas around inequality, ethnic background, and then also the family around academic attainment, if you like, I'd like to jump forward to today, to 2017. And I'd like to consider some of the really critical issues that are being faced within education at the moment in 2017, because I think that right at this point in time, Australian education is really at a major intersection. And it is an intersection where educational discourse is heading in one direction, educational practice is heading in another direction, and then within the melange of all of that is pre-service teacher training, government agendas, and that we appear to be at some sort of an intersection with a whole raft of major issues which are touching down in contemporary Australian educational challenges. So one of the big backbones that Faye's asked me to talk about is this shift, this educational shift was occurring within schools, which is really actually looking at schools more from not a welfare model, which is where traditionally you wait until something is broken and then you intervene, but towards what we would now call a wellbeing model, which is actually looking at what is fundamentally going right within systems, right within schools, right within students, and see them as opportunities to really actually move whole school systems from being good to great to exceptional. And so what I'd like to explore in this next phase is really actually the backbone of this topic of wellbeing to welfare. In doing so, I was reminded of the three books that Kevin published. And one of them, as I was just discussing with Mrs. Marjoribanks this evening, is just about to be reprinted by Rutledge this year, coming up, which is very interesting because it demonstrates the contemporaneous aspect of his research. But really, actually, when you look at the juncture that we're at in contemporary education around a whole raft of issues, the issues of family, inequality, and ethnic background and educational attainment still remain critical for educational discourse. I'd like to illustrate that by arguing a few points here, and these points are going to touch down on three particular publications which I'd like to highlight from research which I've been involved with. The first one is around the whole notion of well-being as a form of education, or well-being as a form of approach within schools. In 2016, I was very fortunate to attend a very interesting conference which I will share with you in a future slide, but the outcome of that was an article which I published called "Why Won't It Stick? Positive Psychology or Positive Education Within Schools," which is an interrogation around why well-being really does not stick within school systems. So many people are interested in it, so many educators are compelled to be involved with it, they're interested in the idea of wellbeing education for young people, but when they try to operationalise it within school systems, so often we see a failed return on investment, so often we see a failed return on investment in teacher professional development, and so often we see a misalignment between school vision, mission and objectives and the operationalisation of wellbeing within schools. And so I wrote a paper about, I did actually come up with some solutions at the end why it should stick, you'd be glad to know, but no one actually really tried to tackle why is it that many schools are investing with it but they can't get traction. The second paper which I'll talk about to a certain degree is entitled Welfare to Wellbeing, which was published at the beginning of this year. You'll be glad to know I've changed my mind on that paper by the time it gets published, and I will outline that one. And the third one is a book which I've just published with my colleague Simon Murray from St Peter's College, who was the 14th headmaster there, and also Gavin Slemp, who is a lecturer at the University of Melbourne, which is Future Directions and Wellbeing, which actually focuses upon some core aspects which intersect quite directly with Kevin's work. So to do that, I just want to raise with you the sobering reality or the sobering claims around the current state of education in Australia. So in a paper which John Hattie published in 2016, which is calling for a reboot of teacher education for this whole country, he quite plainly puts forward that for the last 16 years, Australia has been going backwards systematically on numeracy scores, on literacy scores. And the question is, why is that? When you look at the relative wealth of the country in comparison to other countries. But he does point out that we are going backwards. And it's not just one test, it's this intergenerational test over 16 years. That school performances have been in decline across sectors and between sectors. And then as he puts forward that the PISA results in reading, mathematics and science have slipped in every testing cycle since the turn of this century. And the decline is across every single state and every single territory. Systematically, when you then look at this in terms of the educational attainment and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, it's not a good story. And so one of the key challenges, which is relentlessly reported on in the newspaper again and again, when you open every single newspaper, every testing cycle, are the declining results in numeracy and literacy. What you don't see reported as often is Australia's very, very sobering statistics around student wellbeing. So what I want to do now in this part of the talk is I want you to just think for a moment in terms of the amount of coverage which is given in our press and given widely in Australia around numeracy and literacy scores, and then also our wellbeing scores. What I'm going to put forward to you is this is not an either-or model. So what I'm not putting forward is either wellbeing or it's academic accomplishment. I firmly believe that it's academic accomplishment and wellbeing, and I believe that you can achieve both. But something is needed to help reboot or reset Australian educational discourse around this. Because every time that you open up or look at the news, we get the focus on it's either one or the other. So Australia is not only failing her youth at the moment in terms of numeracy and literacy across a raft of statistics. In terms of wellbeing, we have a number of very sobering statistics which come through in terms of adolescent and youth wellbeing. And we are failing our youth when you look at these statistics. And you've got to ask yourself, what are we doing or what aren't we doing right in order to actually shift from really actually what is a welfare model, which is waiting until something is broken and requiring intervention, to then having a more preventative, proactive approach, which is a well-being question. One of the statistics which I just want to alert you to the ones behind me, comes from the work of the Young and Well CRC unit, which was based at the University of Melbourne. That was headed up by Professor Jane Burns, who's an alumni of the University of Adelaide, actually. And one of the most sobering statistics as an educator, and it really, really affects me every time that I think about it, is the fact that, as the Young and Well CRC tells us, that at least one young person out of 20 in every single classroom, regardless of circumstance in Australia, has attempted suicide. That is one person out of 20 in Year 12, the Young and Well CRC claim, have tried to commit suicide. As an educator, when you're in the classroom, one of the challenges is how do you teach the curriculum, numeracy, literacy, and how do you actually have the skills to actually be able to pick up when a student is languishing and not flourishing, or that they may be flourishing academically but languishing in their well-being? And what can we do about it? So not only, I think, is there a concern, obviously, for numeracy and literacy, I would put forward to you that in part of this equation is that there is a large number of sobering statistics around student wellbeing. One of the hidden statistics, though, that I would like to actually just delve down into, because I think that they are deeply related, is around the statistics on school belonging. A new publication which has come out from the University of Melbourne, written and edited by my colleague Dr. Peggy Kern with Kellyanne Allen, is this new book which has just been published actually in the last month, School Belonging, which looks upon the question of why is it that more and more young people in Australia feel disengaged from school? Why is it that they are not feeling a place where they can arrive and actually feel engaged, they can feel connected, that they can feel safe? And the work that's coming out in terms of belonging is actually pretty important. And the key thing, as has been pointed out by my colleagues at the University of Melbourne, Professor Lee Waters and her team, is that schools play a really key role in promoting belonging, a key role in playing and promoting student wellbeing and also the promotion of student mental health. And also there's a growing level of evidence that supports that when you do that, that also has quite a substantial impact on academic growth and accomplishment as well. So if we just look, for example, I highlighted to you the numeracy and literacy statistics which came from PISA. As I pointed out to you before, it's really actually the belonging statistics which are actually very interesting. And I just want to highlight to you, this is part of the discourse around PISA results which never makes the newspaper. So if, for example, in the 2015 round of PISA data, students who felt like they were an outsider at school were up to 8.6%. 6.8% of students said that they felt more awkward when they were at school, and that over 6% of students claimed that they had trouble making friends at school. And this is a trend which is emerging over the last set of PISA sets of data, which are around school belonging, which are, I think, very, very concerning. Because there, I would put forward to you, is a relationship between school belonging, school engagement, numeracy, literacy, and then also well-being. But unfortunately, in terms of our educational discourse, we seem to be caught between discussing it's either one thing or the other and not taking that holistic approach. Here, I think we can actually really take a major learning away from the work of Professor Majoribanks. Kevin's work highlighted the intrinsic relationship between and across family, ethnic background, and student accomplishment. And there is something that we can learn from revisiting that work, which I think will actually help us to really actually know and understand why is it that Australian students are increasingly feeling isolated within their schools and their communities. The other reality is, and I'm using the quote here, the war on mental illness, which comes from Professor Giulio Lucinio, who was previously the Deputy Director of the Mind and Brain Strand here at SAMRI down on North Terrace. He's just moved on to a new appointment in America. But he claimed that one of the challenges that we face is that we need to engender a war on mental illness, and that we need to actually have a really robust conversation how teachers are actually part of that discussion. And that if we shy away from it, we're actually doing a disservice to the professional practice of teachers who are actually in the maelstrom of that real challenge. And that one of the challenges that is actually faced potentially is when pre-service teachers are then thrust into the classroom in terms of how they are actually prepared, is what skills are we equipping the young teachers as they enter into the profession, not just to become expert therapeutic psychologists, that's not the objective, but to know and understand when a child is languishing as opposed to flourishing or they're being okay, and then also perhaps, if need be, know how to intervene to get that child to support that they need. This is one of the major challenges which is completely overlooked in much of the discourse when you look at, for example, in education policy. The complex nature of teaching, and it is such a complicated profession in terms of its craft and also its science, really actually is then underpinned by these questions around how do we get teachers really actually ready and retain them and retain good people within the actual profession if they are feeling ill-equipped to be able to manage some of these big questions. And then also, how do they actually manage their own well-being when they are thrust into these challenging environments? But then also, for example, if we're supporting teaching, if you like, overall, is how are we looking at the integration of student data into actually making good decisions? So back to the backbone of this presentation this evening, shifting educational discourse really actually from a welfare model to a well-being model. I really want to put forward to you this evening in this claim that I think the educational discourse in Australia is really caught. at this present point, there are so many policy documents, and in our publication Future Directions in Wellbeing, we have a series of very compelling chapters written by some of the world's leading authorities on education policy and wellbeing, including such population psychologists such as Felicia Huppert, who's based at the University of Cambridge, tackling this question, that appears to be a complete challenge for this discourse to be able to move away from, you're either talking about academic accomplishment or you're talking about wellbeing. One of the claims that I've been arguing with some of my co-authors for the last decade is that they are not binary opposites, but somehow within education systems, policies and practices, we have been creating a discourse which is breaking this to us. You're either talking about student academic accomplishment or you're talking about wellbeing. It's very rare that you're talking about both. So, is it all doom and gloom though? And if you listen to the first part of my talk, you'd probably think, I give up now, go choose another profession. But no, I'm actually quite optimistic that we've got to this point of maturity within Australia's education discourse. And why do I have the cause for optimism? So I want to share with you one of the documents which is up here on the screen, the State of Positive Education, which was a report that was commissioned for the World Global Government Summit. This is a remarkable summit which is held in Dubai annually under the patronage of the Supreme Ruler of Dubai, brings together a whole raft of thinkers in terms of areas of public policy, economics, and also education. And this year, the World Global Government Summit decided to have a whole strand dedicated around wellbeing and happiness in education. Now, if you'd said to me 5 years ago that in the United Arab Emirates that this conversation would be taken seriously, I wouldn't have believed you. So I was very fortunate to be invited to attend that conference, but moreover, I had the opportunity to help to co-author this report, which is available on their website as a white paper, which was to table to all 5,000 delegates from governments around the world. It's a unique opportunity to be able to put on the table why wellbeing matters, why wellbeing is just as important as academic accomplishment, and also what role, if any, can pre-service teacher training play within that. And within this report, I do commend it to you. As I said, it's available freely on the World Global Government Summit website with a whole raft of other reports. This report was very well received from a series of ministers from around the world who are really very serious, in particular in the Middle East, at looking at can the science of wellbeing help with the radicalisation, in particular of Islamic youth in that region. And there was a whole raft of conversations. Who knows if the conversations will actually move towards policy interventions, but that is why I'm actually quite optimistic that there is a global conversation which is starting. And in particular, what excites me is that Australia is actually seen as one of the forerunners in terms of being able to offer advice to other parts of the world in terms of integration. Why else do I have optimism? It's because when Simon Murray, myself and Gavin Slemp commissioned 39 authors from around the world to write chapters for our new book, Future Directions on Wellbeing, we sent them one question. Rather than saying, what are you working on right at this very moment in terms of research, we asked them, what is the next big thing in the field? What do you think really excites you? And in terms of why I'm very optimistic is that the education chapter, and the education chapters and the depth of them is showing that there is a willingness to move beyond this welfare or wellbeing discourse and moving beyond academic accomplishment and blind binary views of wellbeing or academic accomplishment. The big question, of course, is, well, how do you do this? And what I'd like to do now in the remaining 20 minutes or so is to really actually delve down into how do you actually take whole systems, schools, and mindsets and move them from a welfare model to a wellbeing model. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm also going to share with you some data from a case study as well of an intervention of this. So the backbone of this, and this is why it was really helpful for me to really actually reflect upon some of the intersections with Jan earlier about Kevin's experiences at Harvard and also my personal experiences at Harvard, because that is a lightning point where I first heard of the work of Jim Collins, who is not in education at all, but is in business. And the whole notion that you can take a whole organisation, system, or whole developed organisations from being pretty good to being great to being exceptional. as he's now revised the model. And I remember when I first read that book in my late 20s, thinking, that is exactly what we ought to be doing. How do you actually find what is working right within systems, right within education, and how do you move from being good to great to excellent? So in terms of my own personal sort of journey towards positive organisational scholarship, this is where the intersection of wellbeing science takes place. And so one of the key things I think that can actually help us is actually the science of positive organisational scholarship. What that is the scientific study of organisations, banks, airline industries, economies, whole education systems that do exceptionally well, and try to work out why is it that they do exceptionally well in spite of circumstance. And this has led in particular to the work around character strengths or understanding strengths of organisations, which comes from the work of Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson, then based at the University of Pennsylvania when this was published. One of the things I think which is absolutely critical is how is it that systems can truly understand what they're doing right to be able to shift from being good to great to exceptional, how they can align that with vision, mission and objectives within whole systems. One of the challenges then is actually how do you do that? Why is the science of human strengths so compelling? In the words of Howard Gardner, and he helped contribute towards this in 2004, he argued that the focus on human strengths, just as weaknesses, is one of the most important endeavours in psychology in the past half century. And what we've started to see emerging within wellbeing science within many schools across Australia and also across the world is that the integration of human science with human strengths within sciences has been a key lever to be able to work out how to realign institutions so that they can actually really move from being good to great to exceptional. And I think that there's an intersection between this work and the early work, empirical work of Kevin Majoribanks. For example, and just to delve down in this, defining wellbeing and what I actually mean by that, one of the most popular definitions of wellbeing, in particular here in Adelaide, amongst many schools across the Department for Education schools, Catholic, independent Lutheran schools within South Australia, is Professor Martin Seligman's PERMA theory, where he argued that there were 5 pillars for wellbeing. That's positive engagement, relationship, meaning and accomplishment. Handy acronym PERMA. And that has been particularly powerful in South Australia in particular due to the Adelaide Thinkers in Residence program which Professor Seligman undertook in 2013 and 2012. Another function or another definition of wellbeing which is really stuck within many schools also here in Australia and also overseas is the definition which has been offered by Felicia Huppert, where wellbeing is a combination of when you feel good and you function well. So if we take those definitions and then you ask the question, well, how do you apply that then to a whole school or to a whole system? What would that look like? This is where we can take a leaf out of the realm of positive organisational scholarship. So positive psychology or wellbeing science is particularly interested in developing tools which actually can enable us to understand how is it that you can shift whole systems from one stage to another stage. What is it that we can do towards systems and also professional practice and also pedagogy that would actually literally realign an institution from an evidence-based approach to be able to make decisions? One of the early descriptors of that was to really actually call schools, universities, colleges, positive institutions. And the reason why they're called positive institutions is because the positive part of the definition is really about this relentless focus upon really actual striving towards excellence, striving towards being exceptional and using tools in order to actually shift whole systems towards that. Why do they matter? Myself and my colleague Lee Waters at the University of Melbourne, we argue that the reason why they matter is because really actually at the heart of it, schools are about deliberately fostering citizenship, virtues and well-being in students, and that these are really very important qualities for our future students to be really fully active agents within school, or within life actually, post-schooling. So just moving on from that, so that's one moment where I think that how can we actually shift whole systems from a welfare model to a wellbeing model. One of them is around having clear definitions and understanding around what wellbeing is. I've given you potentially 2 that could be used. And then how we operationalise that is where I actually want to focus now upon in this next phase here. So positive education, which is an approach to, in particular, learning and teaching, is a very emergent field. It's actually really only been a field since really actually 2009 when it was properly defined. Simon Murray and myself, we decided to look at a whole raft of publications to ask the question, how are people defining positive education? What do they mean? One of the challenges with an emergent field is that, of course, there are diverse definitions and it's actually got an exponential growth, and so keeping up with those definitions. In the review that we did of over 200 or so journal articles and chapters that Simon and I looked at, what we noticed was there were three characteristics around what people claim to be positive education. One is that they were either character-based approaches, or that they were scientifically informed approaches to learning and teaching, or that they were empirically based, or they were a smattering of all three. When you go into many schools and you share this definition with you, they will be able to point to, yeah, we have a character-based or a virtues-based approach to teaching and learning, or they'll say we use some scientific definitions or some scientific literature to inform professional practice, or that they'll go down the empirical route totally in terms of their decision-making. But from this, Simon and I then put forward together a definition around what positive education is. Sorry, I just finished that slide off. And that is that it's an approach to learning and teaching in school systems which uses evidence to actually move schools from being good to great. That was our definition, and I can, if you're interested in those definitions, I can share with you the publications which are for that. But it's really actually about how do you shift whole school systems from one point to the next point in terms of professional practice and pedagogy. I mentioned to you earlier this paper, Why Won't It Stick? And the reason why I want to touch down upon it, because I think it gives my next slide a bit of context around what I'm going to put forward to you is a whole series of pillars that are the backbone of how you break this nexus between you're either educating for wellbeing or academic accomplishment. It's actually for both. And so in 2013, I had a very surreal email that popped in my inbox inviting me to be a delegate at what was a wellbeing meeting that was held by David Cameron at 10 Downing Street. And at the time, the head of the civil service, Lord Gus O'Donnell, was very serious about how can we build the resilience of young people in the UK. And so he invited a whole raft of people from around the world to attend this meeting. And I don't know if any of you have seen the film Love Actually, where Hugh Grant goes into 10 Downing Street, but I had one of those moments where you feel like you're suddenly in a film when you walk into the building, where I moved from being an English teacher for one moment, being in that building was quite surreal. But at that meeting, I was able to hear from a raft of different psychologists and also economists and also civil servants in the UK. And we were asking the question, people were recognising in the UK that wellbeing was a significant problem within schools. Resilience was a significant problem within schools. And that good character was an issue within the UK at the time. Simon Murray and myself were invited because of the work that we had been doing at St Peter's College in Adelaide around wellbeing in particular, to actually share with a case study of what we had done at the school and how we did it and why we did it. And at that meeting, basically, there were a whole raft. There was a lot of goodwill. There was a lot of great conversations. But then out of that came the paper that I wrote was Why Won't It Stick? Because they were really challenging questions. But within that, I argue that really actually I think that there are 5 key pillars which are absolutely essential to move education from a welfare model to a wellbeing model. The hardest is at the top, leadership and governance. Having the right leader in place with the right personal competencies, the right personal resilience, and deep alignment with school governance, so that the vision and mission and the objectives of the organisation, the school if you like, is around education for wellbeing and academic accomplishment. And that's absolutely critical. The second part of the equation, I argue, is that having an alignment between processes within schools. And so one of the key things which I've observed over the last decade working in the field of how you take wellbeing science and make it happen within schools is that so many schools will rush towards professional practice or pedagogy. They'll buy a program, they'll roll it out within their school, and they wonder why it won't stick. And it's usually because they haven't looked at the change management process to align with the professional practice that they want to embed. So they want to move from a welfare model to a wellbeing model, but what they've actually done is they've integrated a wellbeing program within their schools, and they've not aligned it with leadership, governance, and particular processes within the school. So another example is that the behaviour management process within the school actually might contradict the content of the wellbeing lessons which might want to be taught. The fourth one is policy. So how do the policies align around this discussion around wellbeing and academic accomplishment? Is it enshrined within policies, within institutions, organisations or whole systems, that it's an either-or nexus? Because if it's enshrined in policies, it will then show up in pedagogy and process. And so how do you actually shift whole policies, how do you shift whole processes, is by an alignment I put forward to you from a leadership, governance, pedagogy, policies, and then last of all, programs. But teaching is a very interesting profession where many teachers will rush towards the programs, rush towards what the students are being taught in the classroom, without really actually taking stock. And like Kevin Majoribanks did, ask the big questions, look at the big picture, and then see an alignment between the roles of leadership, governance, process, pedagogy, policy and programs. I'd love to get all Ps in those 5 slides. So if anyone has any suggestions for how I can get my first point to have Ps in them, I'm really open to it. I've got to come up with a good acronym in that sort of a way. So in the remaining few minutes or so, what I would like to do is I really want to actually now delve down into really actually the difficult question, I think, in this presentation is this. If we are really serious about changing the nexus between welfare to wellbeing, the backwards movement within numeracy and literacy scores, the challenging the results that we have within wellbeing, we have to ask the really difficult question that within systems and within schools, is the process of change consistent with the programs that we hope to teach? So if we do have agreement that wellbeing matters, that we do think that there is a growing case to take this seriously within schools, one of the really challenging areas is to look at the management of the process of change within institutions and how that's led to make sure that there is a consistency between and across programs, policies, practices. Because until that happens, then I don't think that we're going to get alignment. Now, I'm not kidding you, I don't think, and I've written about this, that this is a silver bullet. So I'm not putting forward to you that the moment that you introduce this, everything is going to be solved. That would be incredibly naive. And I wrote a chapter on that in a book in 2004, Better Than OK, which is really actually, I think it's actually part of the whole school improvement agenda, and it's part of the whole school puzzle, but it's a really, really important thing. I just want to put forward to you that it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything. But if there's one thing that I learnt from Kevin Majoribanks and also George Smolich, it's if you treasure it, then you're going to measure it. So I think that what we do need to develop, and I want to just highlight this paper published with my colleagues from the University of Melbourne and the University of Pennsylvania in 2015 on measuring wellbeing within schools, is that we have to get very serious about having alignment between how wellbeing is understood within schools and the definition of that to actually what we want to measure, so that there is actually a natural synergy between and across the measurement of wellbeing within schools and academic accomplishment, so that there is a consistency between and across the vision, mission and objectives. Why does this matter? It matters a lot for this, I think, particular reason. Felicia Huppert, who's at the University of Cambridge, who founded the Wellbeing Institute there and has been a chief advisor to David Cameron for over a decade, and then also now the current also Prime Minister of the UK on measuring wellbeing at population level, puts forward that when you have a positive intervention, a wellbeing intervention within whole populations, even a small shift towards the right-hand side of that graph can have a substantial impact on the quality of life of not only people who are languishing, but also, more importantly, the people who are on the right-hand side of that graph. So one of the things that I would like you to just reflect upon is that when you consider in the average classroom, yes, as the Young and Well CRC unit point out, that there will be at least 1 out of 20 students who may have contemplated suicide. There are also a whole raft of students in that room who are okay. But that doesn't mean that they're flourishing. And one of the challenges that, if we are really serious about trying to shift whole systems from a welfare model through to a wellbeing model, is that we've actually got to get very serious about the tools, the professional practices, the policy, the leadership and the governance that's required in order to shift whole populations towards the right-hand side of that slide, which is moving people who are okay to being better than being okay. As Faye mentioned in my introduction, I'm an English teacher. So when I teach English to my class, as I'm teaching them the book that I'm teaching, I don't really actually worry about, at the end, whether they're going to read it, write it, about it, talk about it. I just think it's their right to know how to talk about good literature, be able to explore the inner world of that text. And I think that's their right. And in the same way, I think that young people, in particular this generation, have the right to know and understand about their own well-being, to know and understand about the well-being of others, and to know and understand the well-being of the strengths of their peers. Because the literature tells us that more and more often the first port of call that they're going to when they're in trouble is not their parents, it's now their peers as the number one area to whom they turn to, and the second area is the internet. And so I just think it's very important that what we are doing is that we're ensuring that we are equipping students for that. Now, just to round off, what I'd like to do is I just want to alert you to some major findings to research that we have been conducting at St Peter's College now for 7 years. So St Peter's College here in Adelaide is an institution that's 170 years old this year. It has 170 years of doing things in a particular way. It has 170 years of particular values. And in 2011, the governing body of the school took the very bold decision that they looked quite squarely at what the school had been offering, and they argued and they put forward that they had not been doing enough around student wellbeing. They could look to a whole raft of metrics within the school, but they realised actually at the heart of it that their pastoral care program really actually hadn't changed since 1920. And so what they then were very interested in was this emerging field of the application of wellbeing science at the coalface within schools. What can you do to teach young people the skills for resilience, for wellbeing, before they need it? So rather than having the welfare model where it might be the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, what can you do towards engendering this? And so this was part of my role for the last 7 years, actually a major part of it, has been to introduce really actually a shift between pastoral care welfare to actually a wellbeing model, which we've fundamentally achieved within the 7 years that we've been doing this. What have we found over the 6 years? Because as I said before, if you're going to measure it, you're going to treasure it. So over the 6 years, what we've found, we've measured at 3 points in time, both objective and subjective data, a whole raft of things. But the major thing that we have found is that the junior years, and this, if you're a junior years educator, this will be music to your ears, is a major pipeline towards educating for wellbeing within schools. So the ages between 3 through to 11 is a major pipeline, an opportunity to be able to engender an attitude towards wellbeing, knowing and understanding about it, but also as a precursor to adolescent wellbeing and the choppy water that some adolescents can find themselves in at the age of 16. The other major finding that we've had, and these are the three, is that wellbeing now is seen as the new normal, and this comes from the language of the students themselves. In 2011, when we started measuring it, it wasn't normal. It was unusual to talk about it. Now it is seen as just part of normal discourse. It's part of the normal parlance within the school. The third thing, which is most important, which we found out from the measurement of students in particular, is that peer-to-peer knowledge and understanding of wellbeing right across the school has increased exponentially. So now students know and understand not only the factors that make up their own wellbeing in the same way that they learn about algebra, or they learn about history, or they learn about geography, or they go out and play a game of cricket, even if they're in the third 11 like the ones that Kevin used to coach. They actually are having a wellbeing conversation in the same way that they do for all of those other areas of school life. So over a 7-year period, what we've been able to do is really actually shift the discourse within the school from a welfare structure to a wellbeing structure. The other thing which we found, the critical thing, is the peer-to-peer education, because the significance of that is quite simple, is that we've now actually educated over 8,500 men, because we're an all-boys school. We haven't quite got there yet in terms of like the family being complete. I'm being recorded having said that. But one of the really significant factors that the governing board of St Peter's College in 2011 were very, very cognizant was it's an all-male population, we are the weaker sex. When you look at the predictive mental health results for 16 to 24-year-olds, it's a critical mass. And so they were very interested in how can we teach preventative mental health strategies to young people before they need it. So over the last 7 years, what we have done is that we've now educated over 8,500 students in 4 to 5 evidence-based wellbeing lessons, which are just a normal part of their school day. And the objective is that they know and understand their own wellbeing, that they know and understand the wellbeing of the person next to them, and that if that person next to them ends up in strife, they can help them get help. But also, it's about how do you take the boy or girl who is okay and how do you push them towards human flourishing? And that's one of the other areas that we've been focusing upon. I just want to finish on this next slide here, because I'm mindful of time in particular, that the really key part about, I think, and I haven't put it into my 5 logical points around leadership, governance, policy, practice, pedagogy, and in this way, is that at the heart of it was some advice that was given to me by an American colleague of mine, Caroline Adams Miller, who is the author of a fantastic book called Getting Grit. So she looks at why is it that some people have exceptional perseverance? Why do they really persevere about their long-term goals? And Caroline said, well, the great secret, she believes, around the wellbeing work and how you get it to stick within institutions is you've got to give it away. So you can't truly, as an institution, whether it be a school or a whole educational system, or whether it be a bank or a not-for-profit, which is focusing upon trying to shift from welfare to wellbeing, you can't truly ever really actually achieve and break the nexus between it's either academics or wellbeing by not giving it away. And I remember what Caroline said to me, I think there's an element of truth in that. And there have been 2 things or 3 things that St Peter's College here in Adelaide has been really involved with, which I want to commend to you, is it's the setting up of a not-for-profit organisation called the Positive Education Schools Association. This was a group of 14 heads from around Australia. They got together. They were all trying to talk about wellbeing in different ways in their schools, and they said, we need to set up an association to actually share professional practice and really actually give it some traction. And this was 4 years ago. It's now got 1,000 members up and running, completely, really actually from scratch. The other one, which is most interesting, is the International Positive Education Network, which is now, I think, spread to 52 countries around the world. They had their first festival of positive education, which was in Dallas, Texas last year. They're having another one coming up, which was massive. They had over 1,000 attendees in the first year, all looking at how can you use evidence-based preventative mental health strategies to improve school outcomes across all sorts of domains, be it an academic accomplishment, engagement, retention, reducing absenteeism in all sorts of different socioeconomic circumstances. The other project which I just want to share with you, and this I think goes to the heart of Caroline Adams Miller's advice to me about if you're really going to keep wellbeing within an institution, you have to give it away, is that for the last 2 years, St Peter's College has been involved in a very strong relationship with Fremont Elizabeth High School, which is now Playford International High School. The principal there, Rob Knight, has integrated wellbeing into his strategic plan of his school with all of his staff. And he came to Saints and said, you've been doing some really interesting work, can you help us? And of course we said yes. And we've been partnering with them now for 2 years as they literally do a mirror image strategy for their setting and their circumstance to shift their whole population, which by the way is really different from St Peter's College, from being a good school to being a great school to being an exceptional school. Rob is on the same trajectory and he's really ambitious for that. The data which they're collecting, which they're sharing with people at conferences is really exciting. It's been a great catalyst for change for that school as Rob leads it in their new strategy. And the last one which I want to leave you with is a not-for-profit organisation called Where There's a Will, which is based in the Upper Hunter region. It's had quite a bit of coverage on the 7:30 report. Where There's a Will is a not-for-profit named after a young man called Will Carrigan who killed himself on Christmas Day 2 years ago. And his parents set up immediately a foundation. And their objective is quite simple. They want to make sure that every single school, and there are 25 of them within the Upper Hunter region, have integrated wellbeing science in the same way that they teach numeracy and literacy. The Upper Hunter region is radically different from St Peter's College, but that's been a project which we've been involved with for the last 2 years in particular, where we've actually been up to the Upper Hunter region working with over 20 of their schools. We've had some of their student leaders come down with the generous benefaction of some philanthropy from the Day Family Foundation and also the James and Diana Ramsay Foundation based here in Adelaide to support this initiative. But they now are systematically training their school leaders and their teachers in evidence-based approaches to wellbeing to integrate it. Why? Because they understand that to really actually tackle the challenges around numeracy, literacy, wellbeing, school engagement, that one of the key parts of the puzzle is how we actually teach young people the skills for wellbeing before they need it. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, that was nothing short of inspirational, so thank you for taking us on that journey, Matthew. Some key points that I got out of the lecture, and I particularly enjoyed the connections the whole way through to the legacy of Kevin Majoribanks, and I think there were some lovely synergies there with the work and leadership that he showed and your current work today, and that a lot of the issues really haven't shifted that much, which is something as educators we need to think about. You also highlighted the importance of wellbeing, but the challenge that schools have in operationalising that successfully and sustainably for the better outcomes of children. And the connections between academic accomplishment and wellbeing, and we hear a lot about academic achievement of children and young people and the importance of that, but I also believe that wellbeing is a key factor there, and that we should have both of those factors working for our kids. And lastly, the importance of evidence and how we need to shift schools from good to great, and how positive institutions should be something that we should be aiming to strive towards. So thank you for leaving those thoughts with me. We do have some time for questions and comments though, so I'd like to open it up to you to ask Matthew any questions or to make a comment. We do have a roving mic if anyone's voice is a bit crackly. Anyone like to ask a question? Thank you.
Matthew, in I think you said 7 years that you have been working through introducing this at St Peter's, is there one thing that you think, looking back, we wouldn't have done that if I'd known this?
That's a really good question. Can I answer it in two parts? So before I was at St Peter's College, I was at Geelong Grammar School. And I was the first head of positive education there. Best acronym, head of positive education, was HOPE. So thank the Lord they didn't call it Director of Positive Education, because that acronym would not have been good. And so that was a really nascent appointment. Like that was in 2008. The field was brand new, and so I think Saints benefited from some of the early learnings I had there. At Geelong Grammar School, we got one thing I think really wrong at the start, was that we focused. It's actually my sort of 6 points. We focused really actually very much on the programs, and then what happened was that in the first year we thought we have to equip all of these staff, and that was a very big project. This was like, we trained over 270 employees within 18 months, brought a team across from America to do it. It was a high stakes investment for the school. St Peter's College Adelaide did a very similar model, except what we got wrong at Geelong Grammar School was we rushed towards focusing upon the program. So we made sure that the pedagogy was right, so when we rolled it out in the classroom, that students would be engaged, they'd have a good experience, it would dovetail nicely to their other areas. What we got wrong was that we didn't actually focus upon what happens outside of the classroom. And in a school such as that, really actually over I think it's nearly 60% of their students' day is outside of the classroom. And so what we had was that we had the situation where kids were going to wellbeing classes, they were finding out about their strengths, they were finding out what they were good at, they were really energised by this, but then they were running out onto a sporting field and they were having a sports coach give them the complete opposite sort of experience, in particular in some sports like rugby, dare I say, or football, or actually hockey was pretty bad too. Athletics is the worst because it's all about error detection, I've now learnt about. So what we had was that kids were saying, wow, this is really interesting, and then they're running out onto their sporting field, and the coach was giving them the complete opposite feedback. Now, after 20 years of teaching, I've now come to the conclusion that nearly 110% of my students are way smarter than I am. They just turn around and say, what you've just said to me is complete rubbish. Or they were able to point out all the errors in the program because they're way smarter than any educators are. So I think that what we learnt about early engagement at St Peter's College was actually quite a different approach. So that was something we got wrong at Geelong Grammar School. The thing which I think we'd do differently at St Peter's College was around some of our early communications. We went out very hard early about saying this is the direction that we were going into, and then we had quite a substantial lag time before actually getting it up and running. It was, in real time, it was 8 months, but for some parents, they wanted it yesterday because it was universally seen as an issue that needed to be addressed more broadly. So I think if there was anything, it's about the early communications and change management I would do differently. You know, you've communicated it once and you think you've communicated it, but you haven't. But that early learning at Geelong Grammar where a kid ran onto a sports field and got the opposite feedback, and then they'd come back and say, well, this is a load of rubbish. You know, they'd really tell you what they thought. I've given you the edited version. That's what we would do differently. And also the communications, I think, earlier on. Yeah.
Thank you. Matthew, any other comments or questions? Peter, we need a microphone down here. Thanks, Eva. Is that on? There we go.
Thank you for your talk. I came convinced that this well-being thing was a fad. I no longer believe that, and I found your talk extremely interesting, stimulating.
Thank you.
I also have a suggestion about your 5 Ps.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Why not put an adjective in front of the first one and call it professional leadership? Or professional leaders.
Let's talk afterwards, Peter.
Thank you.
Absolutely, very helpful.
I knew if someone was going to solve that problem, Peter, you would be able to. Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Matthew. Have you given any consideration or been involved in any considerations of the application of this in the tertiary sector?
That's a really great question. So yes, I have actually. Three sort of areas for applications within tertiary. I'm assuming you mean like a whole university.
Whole university.
Yeah.
Vocational
Yep.
education.
Yeah.
All of those sectors.
Absolutely. So a recent publication that came out 2 days ago by Sir Anthony Selden and one of his colleagues. Anthony Selden was the Master of Wellington College in the UK and has now been appointed Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham, so which is a private university in the UK, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. So Sir Anthony Selden is Napoleonic. He's about that tall, and he has a vision which is bigger than Ben-Hur. So he wants to create a positive university. So he's put quite squarely on the agenda a whole raft of issues around mental health, sexual assault, engagement and retention in UK universities that are not on the discourse for lots of reasons. And he argues that universities need to reimagine themselves, grow up, and actually really look after the well-being of the students that are in front of the lecturers. And now, for a lot of people, that's common sense, but the reality of common sense and actual, what happens in tertiary education is a bit different. But so he's currently written a new book, which came out 2 days ago. I can't remember the title of it. I'll find out and I'll let you know. Which is arguing for a positive university. The University of Wollongong, actually about 5 years ago, with the work of Lindsay Odes, Lindsay is actually a graduate of the University of Adelaide and is now the director of the Centre for Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne, has also written about this. Some of the university colleges here in Adelaide are very serious around this area. For example, I think it was on my disclosures, I'm on the Education Committee at St Mark's College here at Adelaide. They've been looking really seriously about how can they integrate much of the new wellbeing science into the experience of college students in first year right through to fourth year, and they've done some really, really innovative stuff. There in particular, the Master Rose Alwyn and the Dean Raphaela Erst have looked at this. Yeah, I'll find out the name of that book for you, but it's really actually open territory. In the original article that Marty Seligman and Mike Cheek sent me high wrote in 2000, one of their grand sort of visions was for a positive university. But no one's got there yet, so...
And I can mention a disclosure. How lucky is the School of Education at the University of Adelaide to be having Associate Professor Matthew White join us on staff in January as Associate Professor. So we're really looking forward to your contribution in positive education. Any final questions? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Both my sons went to Saints, but a long time before POSED. And fortunately, I think they emerged with a combination of feeling good and functioning well regardless. You also spoke about wellbeing, talking about at school and beyond. And I think a lack of confidence these days is that they lack confidence and optimism for the future. You know, with the job situation now, and perhaps that could be included in the definition.
Thank you for that. That's really great. I'm not so sceptical about the current generation. They're a very interesting group, the current millennials. One of the things which I've learned, or one of the really exciting byproducts of our wellbeing work at St Peter's College, has been the work of some of our school leaders. I'll just share one story with you, because I think that once you teach this material to young people, they take it to places where we can't possibly imagine the outcome. So in 2012, the then captain vice captain of the school bounced into my office and they said, we want to run a conference. And I said, oh great, okay, why are you coming? Yes, I'll help you, sort of thing. I'll order the name tags or something and we'll make sure you organise it all. But they said they wanted to organise a wellbeing conference. Now when I joined the staff in 2011, the thought of two adolescent boys chomping at the bit to run a wellbeing conference, I was really surprised that they did this. Out of this came a really interesting conference which has been totally student run and led for the last 7 years at St Peter's College, called the National Student Leadership Summit. They gave it a really big name. And they wrote to every single school that they could get their hands on. And one of the critical things that they have now found is they had 136 school leaders across government, Catholic, independent, Lutheran schools descend on the school, and they taught them many of the skills that we teach students at St Peter's College from very young right through to senior students. And what's really exciting is that was students teaching other students, and they ran this whole conference for a day. But the thing which I think is absolutely critical, that the backbone of some of the wellbeing skills which are taught, and I really agree with you that I think that this could be a game changer for young people, is the language of character strengths. So those of you, some of you may know about it, but if you hop online and you type in character strengths profile, you can do a questionnaire. It will give you a set of 24 strengths. You'll find out what they are. And that language is very powerful. Unfortunately, I think there are so many people who leave school and they never know what their strengths are. And so simply understanding and having access to the language around strengths, we can never underestimate the power that they can have on autonomy and self-control of young people and have agency to move towards a different future. And that's where I see it fits beautifully with the work of Kevin Majoribanks, who in one of his books he writes about the power of the inner child and fostering and cherishing the inner child, that imaginative centre that can help create autonomy to move one person from one situation to another. And the language of strengths can be a game changer, I think, in that. I remember my first year of teaching this work at Geelong Grammar School, there was a boy who was in my tutorial group, and his name was Jaden. He was an Indigenous boy who was there on a scholarship, and he did the questionnaire and he said, oh, Doc White, I've done this questionnaire, I don't believe it. I said, why not? He said, I don't have 24 strengths. And he was really serious. He said, I could not possibly have any of the strengths on that page. And I'll never forget that moment where I suddenly, 9 o'clock at night, doing boarding duty, think, you've got to have the conversation. It's like, no, I've seen these strengths demonstrated in you on this occasion, this occasion, this occasion, this occasion. And we went through a conversation. Now, I didn't have that language before. Intuitively, I think I did, but what the science gave me as an educator in professional practice was the ability to have access to that conversation with Jayden. Now, Jayden's now in his 20s, and he's doing really well, but I'll never forget that night when he looked at me straight in the eye and he said, I don't have these strengths. And it's a powerful moment when you can unlock the power of the interior child, I think, for their possibilities. So yeah, I think it can be a game changer for young people in unemployment in particular.
Thank you, Matthew. I think on that note, I'd just like to thank you again. Please join me in thanking Matthew.
Thank you.
I'd also like to acknowledge Jan Marjoribanks for coming all the way over from Sydney and supporting the lecture tonight. Thank you very much.
If I could just compliment Matthew, I thought that was absolutely splendid. And what he's really plugged into with Kevin's work is the inside room. You get the inside room of the child working and the well-being will flow. But do you want to hear a funny story? Yep. Right, here's a funny story. I nearly died when he put up the photo of Kevin in his army kit because it was a great joke in the family. Kevin hated wearing boots, which he was supposed to. And I remember he came home one night and he said, oh look, one of those senior boys said to me, Mr. Marjoribanks, would you mind wearing boots instead of shoes? You should set a good example to the boys. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for attending tonight's lecture. I hope that you've got some takeaways from it. I certainly have. And please join us for some refreshments in the foyer on your way out. Thank you very much.